Imagine stepping back in time to France in the 1780s. On the surface, it might seem like a fairy tale kingdom, ruled by a powerful king and queen from the magnificent palace of Versailles. King Louis XVI held what was called absolute power. This meant that, in theory, what he said was law. He was the ultimate authority, believed to be chosen by God to rule over his people. The royal court was a dazzling world of extravagant clothes, grand balls, and elaborate ceremonies. It was a spectacle designed to show the world the immense power and wealth of the French monarchy, a tradition that had been built up over centuries by kings who wanted everyone to know who was in charge. But if you scratched beneath this glittering surface, you'd find a very different story. French society was rigidly divided into three groups, known as the Three Estates. Think of it as a pyramid. At the very top was the First Estate, which was the clergy, the people of the church. They owned vast amounts of land and paid almost no taxes. Just below them was the Second Estate, the nobility. These were the wealthy lords and ladies, who also owned a great deal of land, held all the important jobs in the army and government, and, like the clergy, were exempt from paying most taxes. This system ensured they kept their wealth and power. At the very bottom of this pyramid, and carrying the weight of everyone else, was the massive Third Estate. This group included absolutely everyone else in France, from poor farmers and city workers to educated lawyers, doctors, and merchants. They made up about 97% of the entire population. Despite their huge numbers, they had almost no say in how the country was run. And most unfairly of all, they were the ones who had to pay all the heavy taxes that funded the kingdom, from the army to the king's lavish lifestyle. This created a deep and simmering resentment that was growing more intense with each passing year. To make matters worse, France was broke. Decades of expensive wars, including helping America in its own revolution against the British, had drained the royal treasury. The extravagant spending of the royal court at Versailles didn't help either. Queen Marie Antoinette, in particular, became a symbol of this out-of-touch spending, earning the nickname Madame Deficit. The government was borrowing more and more money just to pay its bills, driving the country deeper into debt. On top of this financial crisis, a series of bad harvests meant there wasn't enough bread to go around, and the price of what little was available skyrocketed. For ordinary people, this was a life-or-death situation. While the poor were starving and the country was going bankrupt, a different kind of revolution was already happening in the minds of the people. This was the Age of Enlightenment, a powerful intellectual movement that swept across Europe. Thinkers and writers, known as philosophes, began to question everything about the world they lived in. They used reason and science to challenge old traditions and superstitions. They asked big questions. Why should kings have absolute power just because they were born into a royal family? Shouldn't ordinary people have a say in how they are governed? What are the natural rights of a human being? These weren't just abstract debates happening in fancy Parisian salons. The ideas of thinkers like John Locke, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau spread like wildfire. Locke had argued that every person had natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that a government's job was to protect those rights. Voltaire fiercely criticized the Catholic Church and the privileges of the nobility, fighting for freedom of speech and religion. His sharp wit made him a dangerous enemy to the establishment, and his books were often banned, which only made people more eager to read them. These ideas were radical and exciting, offering a completely new way of looking at society. Perhaps the most influential of all was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He wrote that the power to rule didn't come from God, but from the general will of the people themselves. This idea, known as popular sovereignty, was revolutionary. It suggested that the people of France were not simply the king's subjects, they were citizens who could and should form their own government. His famous book, The Social Contract, began with the dramatic line, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." For the millions of people in the Third Estate, these words resonated deeply with their own experience of being burdened by an unfair system. These Enlightenment ideas created a new language of liberty, equality, and rights. They gave the frustrated people of the Third Estate the intellectual tools to articulate their grievances. It was no longer just about being hungry or angry about taxes. It was about injustice and the fundamental rights of man. The American Revolution served as a powerful, real-world example. French soldiers who had fought alongside the Americans came home with stories of a people who had thrown off their king and created a republic based on these very principles. This showed the French that a different kind of world wasn't just a dream, it was possible. By 1789, King Louis XVI was out of options. The country was on the verge of financial collapse, and he desperately needed to raise money, which meant raising taxes. But he knew he couldn't just demand more from the already struggling Third Estate. In a momentous decision, he agreed to call a meeting of the Estates General. This was a grand assembly of representatives from all three estates, something that hadn't happened in 175 years. For the people of the Third Estate, this felt like a historic opportunity. They believed they would finally have a chance to voice their complaints and demand serious reforms from the king. The representatives gathered at Versailles in May 1789, full of hope, but that hope quickly turned to frustration. The old rules of the Estates General stated that each estate would vote as a single block. This meant that the First and Second Estates, the clergy and the nobility, could always outvote the Third Estate 2-1. The representatives of the Third Estate, who represented the vast majority of the French population, realized this system was designed to keep them powerless. They argued for a fairer system where votes would be counted by head, giving them a genuine voice. The king and the other two estates refused to budge. Feeling betrayed and locked out of the discussions, the deputies of the Third Estate took a bold and defiant step. On June 20th, 1789, they found their usual meeting hall locked. Undeterred, they moved to a nearby indoor tennis court. There, standing together, they swore a solemn oath, which we now call the tennis court oath. They pledged not to go home until they had written a new constitution for France. It was a direct challenge to the king's authority. They were no longer just representatives of the Third Estate. They declared themselves a national assembly, the true voice of the French people. This act of political rebellion at Versailles sent shockwaves across the country. The king was faced with a difficult choice: crush this new assembly with force or accept its demands. He seemed to waver, at first making some concessions but also quietly moving troops toward Paris. This made the people of Paris extremely nervous. They feared the king was preparing to attack them and dissolve the National Assembly. Rumors flew through the city, creating an atmosphere of fear and anger. The stage was set for an even more dramatic confrontation, one that would take place not in a palace or a tennis court, but on the streets of Paris itself. As tension mounted in Paris during the hot summer of 1789, the city was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The people were hungry, anxious, and deeply suspicious of the king's soldiers gathering on the outskirts of the city. They needed a way to defend themselves. The cry went out for weapons, and the focus of their search turned to a formidable and grim-looking fortress in the heart of Paris, the Bastille. This medieval prison was more than just a building. It was a powerful symbol of the king's absolute and often cruel power. For centuries, kings had used it to lock away political prisoners without trial. To the people of Paris, it represented tyranny. On the morning of July 14th, a huge crowd of angry citizens, known as sans-culottes because they wore long trousers instead of the knee breeches of the rich, gathered outside the Bastille. Their initial goal was to demand the gunpowder and weapons they believed were stored inside. The governor of the fortress, the Marquis de Launay, refused. Negotiations broke down and panic erupted. Shots were fired into the crowd, turning their anger into a furious rage. The mob, now joined by some sympathetic soldiers from the French Guard, launched a full-scale assault on the fortress. The battle for the Bastille was bloody and chaotic, lasting for several hours. The fortress was old, but it was still a formidable defensive structure. The attackers, however, were driven by a desperate courage and a powerful sense of purpose. They managed to drag cannons into position and aim them at the fortress gates. Realizing his situation was hopeless and wanting to avoid a massacre of his men, the governor finally surrendered. The crowd stormed in, freed the handful of prisoners inside, and captured the governor. In a grim display of the crowd's fury, he was killed, and his head was paraded through the streets on a pike. the fall of the Bastille was a stunning victory for the revolutionaries and a massive blow to the king's authority. It was more than just the capture of a prison. It was a symbolic act that showed the people could defeat the monarchy. The king, when he heard the news, reportedly asked, "Is it a revolt?" A duke famously replied, "No, sire, it is a revolution." This event marked the point of no return. It saved the National Assembly from being crushed and demonstrated that the people of Paris were a force to be reckoned with. July 14th became, and still is, France's National Day, a celebration of the moment the people took power into their own hands. In the wake of the Bastille's fall, a wave of revolutionary excitement swept across France. This period was known as the Great Fear, as peasants in the countryside, inspired by the events in Paris, began to rise up against their feudal lords. They stormed chateaux, burned documents that listed their feudal obligations, and declared an end to centuries of servitude. The old social order was collapsing. In response, the National Assembly took a dramatic step on the night of August 4, 1789. In a frenzy of patriotic enthusiasm, nobles and clergy stood up one by one to renounce their ancient privileges, including their exemption from taxes. Feudalism was officially abolished overnight. Building on this momentum, the Assembly set out to draft a document that would define the principles of their new society. On August 26th, they issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This was, honestly, one of the most important documents in modern history. Heavily influenced by the Enlightenment ideas of Locke and Rousseau and the American Declaration of Independence, it laid out a vision for a new France. It declared that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, and that these rights included liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It asserted that all power comes from the people, not the king. However, King Louis XVI was still at Versailles, and he had not yet approved these radical changes. While the Assembly debated the future, the people of Paris were once again growing hungry and impatient. In October, a large crowd of women, furious about the high price of bread, decided to take matters into their own hands. They marched the 12 miles from Paris to Versailles, armed with whatever they could find. They were determined to bring their demands directly to the king. This Women's March on Versailles was a pivotal moment, showing that ordinary women were key players in the revolution. When the massive crowd arrived at the palace, they demanded that the king not only provide bread, but also accept the Declaration of the Rights of Man and move his court to Paris. After a tense standoff, the king had no choice but to agree. The next day, the royal family was escorted back to Paris by the crowd, essentially becoming prisoners of the revolution in the Tuileries Palace. This move dramatically shifted the balance of power. The king and the National Assembly were now in Paris, under the watchful eye of its radical citizens. France was still a monarchy, but the king's absolute power was gone forever. He was now a constitutional monarch, subject to the law and the will of the people. The new constitutional monarchy was a fragile compromise, and it didn't last long. King Louis XVI, though he publicly swore an oath to the new constitution in 1791, privately resented his loss of power. He and his family felt like prisoners in Paris. In June of 1791, they made a desperate attempt to escape. Disguised as servants, the royal family fled the city in a carriage, hoping to reach the Austrian border where they could rally support from other European monarchs. But they were recognized in the small town of Varennes and captured. This flight to Varennes was a disaster for the king. It shattered any remaining trust the people had in him, proving he was a traitor to the revolution. This event pushed the revolution in a much more radical direction. Calls for an end to the monarchy and the creation of a republic grew louder. Political clubs like the fiercely Republican Jacobins gained more and more influence. They argued that as long as the king remained, the revolution would be in danger. Meanwhile, the other crowned heads of Europe were watching the events in France with growing alarm. They feared that the revolutionary ideas of liberty and equality might spread to their own countries. In April of 1792, France declared war on Austria and Prussia, partly as a way to export the revolution and partly in response to threats from these foreign powers. The war started badly for France, and the threat of foreign invasion created an atmosphere of panic and paranoia. Radicals claimed the king and queen were secretly conspiring with the enemy. In August 1792, a mob of revolutionaries stormed the Tuileries Palace, massacring the Swiss guards and imprisoning the royal family. The constitutional monarchy was over. A new, more radical governing body, the National Convention, was elected. Its first major act, on September 21, 1792, was to formally abolish the monarchy and declare France a republic. The slogan of the revolution now became liberty, equality, fraternity. The convention then had to decide what to do with the former king, now known simply as Citizen Louis Capet. The Jacobins, led by powerful figures like Maximilien Robespierre, argued that he must be executed to ensure the republic could survive. Louis must die so that the country may live, Robespierre declared. After a tense trial, the convention narrowly voted for his execution. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by the guillotine in a public square in Paris. This shocking act sent a clear message to France and all of Europe. The revolution would not be turned back. It was a complete and final break with 1,000 years of French monarchy. The execution of the king plunged France into its most intense and violent phase, the Reign of Terror. The young republic was facing enemies on all sides. Foreign armies were invading, there were royalist rebellions in the countryside, and economic problems were causing widespread unrest. In this atmosphere of crisis, the radical Jacobins, led by Robespierre, seized control of the government. They created the Committee of Public Safety, a powerful 12-man council that was given almost dictatorial powers to defend the revolution from its enemies, both internal and external. Their goal was to use terror to enforce loyalty and create a republic of virtue. What followed was a period of extreme paranoia and brutal repression that lasted from 1793 to 1794. The Committee of Public Safety passed the Law of Suspects, which allowed for the arrest of anyone who was deemed an enemy of liberty. This could be anyone from a former nobleman or a priest to someone who simply complained about the price of bread. Revolutionary tribunals were set up to try these suspects, but the trials were often a sham. People were condemned with little or no evidence. The guillotine, promoted as a more humane method of execution, became the terrifying symbol of this period, its blade falling daily in the public squares of Paris and other cities. During the Terror, an estimated 40,000 people were executed or died in prison. It was a time when no one felt safe. A careless word or a personal grudge could lead to an accusation and a death sentence. The revolution began to devour its own. Early revolutionary leaders who were seen as not radical enough, like Georges Danton, were sent to the guillotine. Robespierre and his followers were trying to create a perfect, virtuous republic, and they believed any price was worth paying to achieve it. They introduced radical reforms, such as a new calendar, the metric system, and a campaign to de-Christianize France, replacing God with a cult of the supreme being. By the summer of 1794, however, many people in France, including members of the National Convention, began to fear that the Terror had gone too far. Robespierre himself seemed to be growing more paranoid and tyrannical. French armies were now winning on the battlefield, so the argument that terror was needed to save the country was losing its power. Fearing they would be his next victims, a group of his opponents in the convention organized against him. On July 27, 1794, or 9 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, they had Robespierre arrested. The very next day, the architect of the Terror met the same fate as his victims. He was executed by the guillotine, bringing the Reign of Terror to a sudden and bloody end. With Robespierre's fall, the revolution took another sharp turn. The period that followed is known as the Thermidorian reaction, a move away from the radicalism of the Jacobins. The surviving members of the National Convention dismantled the machinery of the Terror. The Committee of Public Safety was stripped of its power, the revolutionary tribunals were shut down, and the Jacobin Club was closed. People were tired of the bloodshed and the strict rules of the Republic of Virtue. A new mood swept through Paris, with a return to fancy clothes, parties, and a more relaxed social life for those who could afford it. In 1795, the convention wrote yet another constitution, creating a new form of government called the Directory. This was an attempt to find stability and prevent another dictatorship like Robespierre's or a return to monarchy. Power was placed in the hands of 5 directors, with a 2-house legislature. However, the Directory was a weak and corrupt government. It struggled to solve France's continuing economic problems, and it faced threats from both royalists who wanted to restore the monarchy and radical Jacobins who wanted to bring back the terror. The government was unstable and lurching from one crisis to another. It was during this chaotic period that a brilliant and ambitious young army general began to make a name for himself: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had been a supporter of the revolution and had achieved incredible success leading the French armies in a series of stunning victories, particularly in Italy. He was seen by many as a national hero, a man of action who could get things done. In 1795, he famously saved the Directory from a royalist mob in Paris by firing cannons into the crowd, a whiff of grape shot, as he called it. He became increasingly indispensable to the weak government. By 1799, the Directory was deeply unpopular, and many in France longed for a strong leader who could bring order and stability after a decade of revolutionary chaos. Seeing his chance, Napoleon joined a plot to overthrow the government. In November 1799, in a coup d'état known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire, he and his allies seized power. At first, he ruled as one of 3 consuls, but it was clear from the beginning who was really in charge. Within a few years, he would declare himself Emperor of the French. The French Revolution was over, and the age of Napoleon had begun. A general had finally brought order, but at the cost of the Republic. The French Revolution was a messy, violent, and chaotic decade, but its impact on France and the world was profound and permanent. First and foremost, it completely destroyed the old order in France. The absolute monarchy that had ruled for 1,000 years was gone forever. The rigid system of the 3 estates, with its inherited privileges for the clergy and nobility, was dismantled. Even though the monarchy was briefly restored later in the 19th century, it was never an absolute one. The revolution established the principle that the people were the source of power, not a king. The revolution also brought about huge social changes. It swept away the last remnants of feudalism, freeing the peasantry from their ancient obligations to local lords. It opened up careers to talented people from any social class, not just the nobility. Napoleon's rule would solidify this idea of a career open to talent. The revolution also led to the creation of a unified legal system, the Napoleonic Code, which was based on principles of equality before the law. A standardized system of weights and measures, the metric system, was created, as were new administrative departments for the country, many of which still exist today. The ideas of the revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, did not stay within France's borders. The French revolutionary armies and later Napoleon's armies marched across Europe, and they brought these radical ideas with them. They challenged monarchies and feudal systems everywhere they went. The Declaration of the Rights of Man inspired people all over the world to fight for their own rights and for national independence. The revolution sparked the growth of nationalism, the idea that people with a common language, culture, and history form a nation and have the right to govern themselves. Ultimately, the French Revolution was a turning point in human history. It set the stage for the modern world by popularizing the ideas of democracy, individual rights, and nationalism. While it led to dictatorship under Napoleon and did not create a stable democracy overnight, it planted the seeds for the democratic movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. It showed that ordinary people could rise up and fundamentally change the way they were governed. The world we live in today, with its emphasis on human rights and popular sovereignty, was profoundly shaped by the brave, desperate, and often brutal events that began in France in 1789.